Okay, so we're gonna begin to look at the Amidah. We're not going to actually get to the first bracha tonight. We're going to give some background on the Amidah. Amidah, Tefilah, and Shmona Esrei. These are the different names that are used for the Amidah. Okay, obviously, one of the most significant prayers in Judaism. Obviously, it's at the heart of their daily prayers. Every single Tefilah that we have centers around an Amidah, Shacharis, Mincha, Musaf, Ma'ariv. The Amidah is the centerpiece of every single Tefilah that we pray. The word Amidah by itself means standing, because that's the position in which it's recited. And of course, it's all often referred to as the Shmona Esrei. And we're going to see why that's true when there are never 18 brachos in the Shmona Esrei. The word Shmona Esrei literally, of course, means 18, but there are never 18 brachos only in the Shmona Esrei, in the Amidah. So why do we refer to it as the Amidah, as the Shmona Esrei? When was it composed? Originally at the beginning of the Second Temple era by the Anshe Knesset Hagadola, by the men of the Great Assembly. I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody because I'm getting a little bit distracted by all the noise of people moving around. It's unintentional, but I do find it a little bit distracting. So hope you're okay with that. If anybody needs to unmute, you can do so. I've allowed you to unmute yourself. Okay. And let's see. Have some people join us a little bit later. Wonderful. Glad to see everybody. All right. You know, it would be amazing if all of you were on treadmills at the same time. That would be fascinating to give a share to you. If everybody was on a treadmill at the same time, that would be really interesting. Okay. So the first section has to do with the composition of the Tefilah, of the prayer itself. We know, we already learned it. We're going to review a couple of things that we've said before. Tefilah, or prayer, is one of the three pillars of Judaism. Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasadim. Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasadim are the three pillars of Yiddishkeit, not just of the world. The Mishnah tells us in Pirkei Avos that the world stands on three things: Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasadim. And it's pretty clear that that's not just the world, but obviously that's Judaism, and that is Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasadim. The Gemara in Megillah tells us that this is the Gemara in Megillah on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis. Amar Rabbi Yochanan v'Amila Masnisa Tana. Some say it was taught by Tanoim, some say it was Rabbi Yochanan, who was one of the early Amoraim. Mea ve'eshim zekanim. There were 120 sages. Ubehem kama neviim, and amongst them are many neviim. And together, tiknu shmona esrei brachos ala seder. Together they established the 18 blessings in the order, of course, that we have today. Now I ask you, do you know of any book, document, that's been composed? How many people did it take to compose the Declaration of Independence? Does anybody know? I'm just curious. Were there 2 or 3 primary authors together with, yeah, you can Google it, I know. Were there 2 or 3 primary authors and then a bunch of other people contributed? How did it work? Does anyone know? You can say that again, I didn't hear.
One primary author, Jefferson, and then contributors.
Contributors, okay. How about the Constitution? I imagine that was, before you get to the amendments, I imagine that was more people? Okay. I don't know. Where's Barry? Barry, do you know these things? Like, you're talking, but I can't hear you. You have to press the space bar or something like that, or unmute yourself. I cannot unmute myself.
You
There you
hear
go.
me now?
Now we can. Go for it.
Okay, I think there are about 40 signatories to the Constitution.
James Mason wrote it.
Mason was
didn't he?
one.
He wrote it.
No, it was a group effort. There were vigorous debates. I'm not aware that Mason wrote it.
Okay. All right. Be that as it may, it's interesting. The concept of an important document having many authors is obviously not a new one for us. This is what the Gemara Megillah is telling us, that the Amidah had 120 different elders, 120 different Chachamim contributed to the writing of the Amidah. So if you ask me who's the author of the Amidah, the answer is yeah. There are many authors. They were all part of a group who were called the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, but essentially they were the sages of the time period. What I mean to say is, we're familiar with the concept of Tanoim or Amoraim. Tanoim are the rabbis during the period of Mishnah and Breita. Amoraim are the rabbis during the period of the Gemara. We have Geonim, Rishonim, Achronim. This is different generations of rabbis. The Anshe Knesset Gedolah was the generation of the rabbis from the end of the first Beis Hamikdash through the Babylonian exile and the beginning of the second temple. They were called the men of the Great Assembly, and they preceded, of course, the Tanoim. Okay, and these there was a group of 120 of them who established the 18 brachos in the order that we have today. It's a very specific order to them, which we'll eventually get to. They lived around the 4th century before the Common Era. If you want to know when exactly that was, between the first and the second temple, which makes sense because the second temple was destroyed. I guess at around the Common Era. Okay, and was around for 400 years or so. Their accomplishment is that they standardized Jewish prayer, which had not been standardized before. Rabbeinu Bachya in his sefer called Kad HaKemach, we've quoted him before, and the Rambam also wrote this as well, says that before the Amidah was established, people prayed using whatever words they wanted to. From the time of Moshe all the way until the period of the men of the Great Assembly, prayer was not arranged in any definite order. Each individual prayed for himself or herself according to his or her knowledge, wisdom, and clarity of expression. That was the general practice. We've talked about this in previous classes. That's what it meant when the Rambam says some people knew how to pray and some didn't, because it required a certain level of knowledge, wisdom, or clarity. I said maybe meditative state. That's what I added to it. So in order for people to pray, people did their own thing. But when the men of the Great Assembly came along and they ordained the Amidah, and they did so that there would be a set prayer for the people of Israel alike. Now, I want to say something that's kind of obvious, but we're going to see a source for it in a moment. We'll see a source for it in a second. Why did they do this? Why did they feel the need to establish and order a particular way of prayer? I think the same way that Rabbi Yehuda Nessi wrote down the Mishnah, because people were forgetting, so in order to make the Torah Shabbal Peh, the oral Torah, accessible for Jews and for Judaism, so he had to write something down. So he codified the Mishnah. Ravina, or Rav Avina, and Rav Ashi did the same thing with the Gemara a few hundred years later. The men of the Great Assembly said, look, we, without a Beis HaMikdash today, we're at a lower spiritual level than our predecessors were. Most people don't know how to pray. Let us set up official prayers so that everybody has access to praying. That's my understanding. And I think we'll see that the Rambam more or less says that idea. We'll read it together inside. The Rambam is in Hilchos Tefilah, and he writes as follows. When Israel was exiled at the time of the wicked Nebuchadnezzar, okay, that's what he says in Hebrew, Nebuchadnezzar HaRasha. When the Jewish people were exiled at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar was the Babylonian emperor. He was the one who was himself, I don't know if himself, Nebuchadnezzar, I think, was his chief butcher, was the one who actually was tasked with the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem. But Nebuchadnezzar was the emperor. He was Babylonian. He exiled the Jewish people, mostly to Babel, to Iraq and Iran, etc. Paras and Madai were the Persia and Media. They're the ones who took over from the Babylonians. And the Jewish people mixed with Persia, Greece, other nations. That was throughout history. They had children in those foreign lands. As you might expect, those children spoke mixed languages. And each person's language is made up of many different languages. Does that sound familiar? Each person's language is made up of many different languages. Rav Hordner's joke was that our yeshivas today educate our children to be illiterate in 3 languages: Hebrew, English, and Yiddish. And many people, I myself, Baruch Hashem, I'm fairly well spoken. I mean, you know better than I how well spoken I am, because you get to listen to me, or you're forced to listen to me. I'm not sure which one. But sometimes I grasp for the English word, even though, quote unquote, it's my first language. Why? Because I grew up around people who spoke other languages. And as a result, the language that's in my mind is multiple. I have multiple languages in my mind. Or I may say I have a riboy of lashonos in my mind. Okay? That time I say the same thing. Somebody came up with a, oh, never mind. But if you want to be amused, or I'm not sure amused or depressed, but there's a book called From Speak. You can look it up. It's a dictionary. Do you remember it, Andy? It's from many years ago, many years ago, and they rewrote the Gettysburg Address and many other famous speeches and important declarations into Yeshivish. It's quite fascinating, especially if you understand the Yiddish and the Yeshivish. Okay, at any rate, because the Jewish people were not in their homeland, they ended up speaking different languages. Just by the way, a little aside for the Parsha, just a tiny little aside for the Parsha, is that if you think about it, we know that the Jewish people in Egypt, they maintained their names, their clothing, and their language. Why was that such a big deal? That was such a big deal because it's not typical to maintain your language. It's not typical at all. What happens when Americans move to Israel? Andy, what language do your grandchildren respond to your son and your daughter-in-law in? English or Hebrew? Or a combination?
English.
And the younger ones?
English.
And the younger ones, English. That's because they live in Anglo areas. But if they lived in other areas, it would be less likely. Okay?
It's intentional.
Of course it's intentional. I mean, if it wasn't intentional, what language would they be responding to them in? Without a doubt. I have first cousins who you would never believe their parents are American. You just wouldn't believe it. And whatever, every family has to decide what's best for them. Okay. So it continues the Rambam. When a person would speak, he would not be able to express himself properly because of the language confusion. This is the meaning of the verse. It's in Nehemiah, which deals with that time period, because even though it's part of Nach, but it's the end of the first temple and the beginning of the second temple. Nehemiah says, their children spoke half in the speech of Ashdod and could not speak in the language of the Jews, but according to the language of each people. Because of this, when each person would pray, he would be unable to fully express all his needs or to say the full praise of God in Hebrew without using other languages as well. So here, the Rambam is saying much more than I was saying. I was saying that the same way, just a spiritual thing, that the same way people were beginning to forget Mishnah, they have to write down the Mishnah. They had to forget the Gemara, they had to write down the Gemara, and therefore they weren't able to daven, so we had to give them davening. The Rambam was saying more than that. The Rambam was saying that when Ezra and his court saw this, that people could not articulate themselves in Lashon Kodesh, so Ezra and his court saw this, they arose, they established for them the Amidah blessing and their order. Okay, so that's where the Amidah, that was the impetus for the Amidah, according to the Rambam. Rabbeinu Bachya adds a point over here. This is his commentary to Parshas Eikev. And there he writes that the men of the Great Assembly instituted this prayer of the Amidah in order that it should be fluent in every mouth. And so that's one point. Now, point number one is it should be fluent, which, if you think about it, for many of us, it is fluent. It's not, if you've been davening Shemona Esrei in Hebrew your whole life, it's so fluent that you can say without even thinking about it, which has its own set of problems. But you never go to shul or daven at home and think, okay, what's the next word? What do I say? I'll tell you something interesting, is that I went to school, I learned Nusach Svard. I went to Torah Semes growing up, and because I went to Torah Semes growing up, I learned how to davening Nusach Svard. The Nusach Svard is, for example, the Chonein Ladam Das, Madam Lenesh Bina, Chaneinu Me'itcha, Chachma Bina V'das. But my parents daven Nusach Ashkenaz, which is Chaneinu Me'itcha, Dea Bina V'Haskel. There are other differences. For example, in the third bracha of the Amidah, Takadosh, Shimcha Kadosh, Doshim B'chol Yom Yadu Chasela. Ashkenaz says, Baruch Atah Hashem HaKel HaKadosh. Svard says, Ki Kel Noach Gadol V'Kadosh Ata. Baruch Atah Hashem HaKel HaKadosh. I could theoretically, I don't know if I could do it perfectly or not, I could theoretically daven Ashkenaz by heart and Svard by heart, and I definitely could do a mixed up version of it because of the fact that I have this confusion, okay? But as we'll see, the differences really are minor in the nuschos that we have today. Essentially, it's all based on the core nusach that the Amshek Netzach Gedola established. The word nusach might be translated as liturgy, okay? So the Rabbeinu Bechaya says that the men of the Great Assembly instituted the prayer of Amidah. Why? So it should be fluent in every mouth. But then he says that the language they use was simple language in order not to confuse the ideas with their understanding of the language, so that all of Israel will be equal in prayer, whether they were clever or foolish. In Hebrew it says, bein chachamim bein tifshim, intelligent or dumb. Okay, intelligent or unintelligent. That's a second point, which is that the language that they use, it's not a highly poetic, which is actually a fascinating idea by itself. It's not a highly poetic Hebrew. Does that ring right to you? When you read the Hebrew of the Amidah, the Hebrew is fairly simple. There's many other tefillot, Tehillim, Psukei de Zimra, Nishmas. The Hebrew is much more difficult. Yashir obviously comes from the Torah itself. The Hebrew is much more challenging. The Hebrew in the Amidah is fairly simple. The words are not that challenging for those that you know. It's Hebrew 101. It's not Hebrew 103. It's an interesting idea by itself. And again, why? Because it was written for the general population. Jerry, do you agree? When you think about the Hebrew that's used in the Amidah, I think it makes sense. If you think about it, pay attention. If you didn't have Marav yet, when you have Marav tonight, or if you already have Marav tonight, tomorrow morning at Shachar, pay attention to the Hebrew. See if that makes any sense. Again, obviously you have to have some understanding of Hebrew in order to have that appreciation, but that's an interesting idea that Rabbeinu Bechaya shares about the construction of the actual language that's used in the Amidah. Rabbi Beryl Wine has something called Crash Course in Jewish History from www.jewishhistory.org. And he has a very interesting, sociological sort of a comment about the Amidah. And I'll share it with you. We'll look at it together. Let's see what he says. One monumental accomplishment of the men of the Great Assembly was the formulation of a universal Jewish prayer service. Those of you that know Beryl Wine's voice, I'm channeling it. I'm not doing a great job, but I'm channeling it. Today, the centerpiece of every service is the prayer known as the Amidah, literally the standing prayer. It and its attendant prayers were apparently absent in the First Temple era. The need for such a formalized prayer only first arose when the Jews went into exile in Babylon. During the exile, the communal experience of the 3 times a year pilgrimage to the temple left a vacuum. Without the temple, essential nutrients in the people's religious diet were lacking. Therefore, the leaders in Babylon codified a system of prayer that substituted for the temple service. They based this on the prophetic verse, "Our lips will substitute for sacrifices," which is in Hosea chapter 14. This is perhaps the most famous verse, by the way, about prayer. When the Shalim Parim Satenu is the language. When the Jews returned from Babylon to the land of Israel and rebuilt the temple, they brought along with them the prayers they had learned in Babylon. The men of the Great Assembly arranged, placed in order, edited, and formulated the words of Amidah, as well as the accompanying prayers. This arrangement continued through the entire Second Temple era and has continued until today. This is a fascinating question that's answered here. Many people are really curious about this, which is, did they pray during the era of the Second Temple? According to Rabbi Wine, and what he's saying over here, and really according to everything that we've said, it fits very much. The arrangement continued through the entire Second Temple era. So that means during the Second Temple era, even though they had sacrifices, they did daven at that time. The Amidah. Did they have minyanim? Did they have batei knesiot? You know, that we'll see. Hopefully, we'll see when all that was organized. Although the individual synagogue system was inferior, it successfully compensated for the shift in Jewish life away from the centralized temple system. Now, with the stamp of approval from the men of the Great Assembly, the Jewish prayer became possible in each community by each individual, no matter how far he or she was. Instituting prayer this way not only substituted for the temple service, but compensated for the loss of its central place in Jewish life. I want to add one thing, which is that if you know your Jewish history and you think about the Second Temple era, the Second Temple era and the First Temple era are apples and oranges from many perspectives. The Second Temple era was not like a Mashiach came. The Jews were, generally speaking, under the control of their host, even though it was quote unquote their country, but generally speaking, the Jewish people had been conquered by somebody. Okay? They were given permission to build the temple and to perhaps they had Jewish governors but they always answered to some sort of other country until the Hashmonaim defeated the Greeks. And then for the last 120 years or so, 110 years of the Second Temple is when the Jewish people ruled, had autonomy in Israel. But even that time period was disastrous from the perspective of a religion. And there's a new Kohen Gadol every single year. The Kohen Gadol sometimes went to a person who wasn't even a Kohen, if I'm not mistaken. The Kohen Gadol was sold. There were bribes. There was corruption. By no means was the Second Temple era a utopian era for the Jewish people. First Temple era, there was certainly during the time of Shlomo, for sure. That was the utopian era in Jewish history. So the fact that during the Second Temple they had the Amidah for people, it resonates. It rings. Not obviously it's true, but it makes sense. And what I mean by that is because if you consider the fact that the temple itself was politicized, So perhaps it didn't maintain itself as the center of the religion the way that it used to. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay? Jerry, did you have a question? I thought maybe you had a question. I thought maybe you were raising your hand. Are you trying to unmute? Not sure if he's trying to unmute. Jerry? Did you have a question? Are you okay? All right. All right, later variations. Now, obviously, like we said, the men of the Great Assembly established and they wrote the Amidah. Now, over time, variation certainly crept into the prayer, and that's obvious. Sephardim have a Shemona Esrei, Ashkenazim have a Shemona Esrei, Hasidim have a Shemona Esrei. The Italians, if I'm not mistaken, have their own siddur, if I'm not mistaken. Even amongst Sephardim, there's two different siddurim, the Idut Mizrach siddur, and then the Sephardi siddur. There's two different variations of it. What we have in common is the order of the brachas remains the same. First bracha, first three are blessings of praise. The first one is called avos, the second one is called gevuros, the third one is called kedusha, and then you ask for wisdom. And the same order that we have, everybody has. That's something that we all have in common. The words, I would say, are 80 to 90% the same. There's some minor variations. So that's one thing that's worth pointing out. Additionally, after the destruction of the second temple, there were certain key amendments needed to be made in the text of the prayers. In the 2nd century of the Common Era, the sages finalized the version of Amidah as we have it today. Okay, the next quote is from Meir Holder, and I will share that with you so you can read together. History of the Jewish People from Yavne to Pumbedisa, the Sur publications. The Amidah was finalized after the destruction of the Second Temple. From the very beginning, prayer, both public and individual, has always been a part of Jewish life. These prayers have been given specific formulation by the men of the Great Assembly who composed the Amidah, which formed the backbone of the prayer service. Okay. During the centuries, however, a number of variations crept into the text of his prayer. Moreover, during the troubled times preceding destruction, some confusion arose about the correct order in which the blessings are to be recited. While the temple stood, the people were unified by the fact that they had a central national place of worship. Now that the prayers of their lips were to take the place of the sacrifices offered in the temple, people would be united or unified by the fact that wherever they were, they spoke the same words when praying to God. People make a big deal of Daf Yomi, rightfully so. If you're learning Daf Yomi, wherever you go in the world, you can find a shiur learning this exact same page of Gemara. And that's awesome, if you think about that. That's amazing. Now, what's more amazing is, whatever shul you go to in the world, they're going to daven the same Shemona Esrei that you daven. It's not like the church that has, and I'm not a big expert here, but I imagine that even churches of the same similar denominations are going to have their own way of doing things, and each church has a unique service. Shuls essentially are identical. Essentially, there's going to be, again, minor differences. When do you say the Yom? Do you say Anam Zmiros? Do you say a prayer for the Medina? But essentially, shuls are identical all around the world. That's pretty amazing. It now became urgent, therefore, that the different variations that have crept into Amidah be brought together into one unified text with the proper order. Furthermore, the destruction of Jerusalem and the suspension of the temple service required that a number of important amendments be made in the content of the prayers. For example, and this makes a lot of sense if you think about it. For example, prayers for the continued survival of Jerusalem and the temple service had to be changed to prayers for the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the return of the temple service. Doesn't that make sense? Of course it makes sense. Because during the Second Temple, why would you daven that Jerusalem be rebuilt? It was built. During the Second Temple era, why would you daven for the Davidic dynasty? Didn't they have a king? Maybe they didn't. They didn't. But a lot of things didn't fit for the Second Temple era. But obviously, once the Second Temple was destroyed, so the whole bracha of Ritzei Hashem Elokeinu es Amcha Yisrael ufilasam v'hashev es ha'avoda l'dvir beisecha. Return the service to Dvir Beisecha, which is basically your Beis Hamikdash. Okay. Let our eyes see the return of God's presence, the Shekhinah, with mercy. What do you mean? The Beis Hamikdash is in Yerushalayim. What are you davening for? Obviously, that text was changed from the survival of Jerusalem and the temple service to rebuilding of Jerusalem and the return of the temple service. The man who undertook the task of unifying the text was named Shimon. His name was Shimon HaPikoli. How do we know this, by the way, everybody? How do we know this? This all comes from the Gemaras and Brachas. Okay? Shimon HaPikoli was a contemporary of Rabban Gamliel, the first leader of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, once it moved to Yavne after the destruction of the Second Temple. Perhaps you recall that story. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a Tana. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a Tana, which means he was a rabbi from the period of the time of the Mishnah. And he lived at the end of the Second Temple. The Romans besieged Jerusalem, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai managed to escape. And one of the requests that he made was, Kainli Yavne v'chachameha. Give me Yavne and its sages. That was one of the requests that he made, which essentially was, give me Yavne and give me the Sanhedrin, which he did. I think Vespasian, if I'm not mistaken, was the governor he was speaking to, but I may have that wrong. Okay, so the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, moved to Yavne after the destruction of the Second Temple. It's around 70 of the Common Era. The Gemara in Brachos tells us, page 28b, Shimon HaPikoli arranged the order of the 18 brachos before Rabban Gamliel at Yavne, meaning he was the one who was appointed to, at the behest of the Sanhedrin, to codify the Shemona Esrei, essentially.
What about Shmuel HaKatan? Is it?
Oh, we're getting to Shmuel HaKatan in a moment. Okay, very good, very, very good. Okay, and Shmuel HaKatan is relevant to the 19th bracha. The turmoil at the end of the Second Temple and its subsequent destruction was accompanied by the rise of a number of movements amongst the Jewish people. Sensing the threat posed by these groups to the survival of traditional Judaism, an additional blessing was incorporated into the Amidah with the goal of preventing their intermingling within Jewish society. Actually, a fascinating idea. Okay. In other words, we were concerned, I suppose, that people should know what's right and people should know what's wrong. People should know who represents authentic Torah Judaism, and people should know who doesn't represent authentic Torah Judaism, even though they may look very similar. But their hashkafos, their perspective, their approach to Yiddishkeit is one that at the time the Chachamim considered to be anathema to the correct way to approach Hashem. And like we talked about on Hanukkah, with regard to the Misyavnim, the Greeks, the Jews who wanted to be Greeks, or be acculturated into Greek culture. And therefore the bracha was established with the intention of basically drawing the line, us and them. Birkat Haminim, the blessing against the heretics, we refer to as V'la Malshinim. V'la Malshinim al Tehi Tikva. They should have no hope. That bracha served to make those groups no longer feel comfortable davening in synagogues, where the new blessing to the Amidah was added. This edition was instituted under the auspices of Rabban Gamliel in Yavne. We'll see in a moment, like Barry said, the rabbi who did so, who authored it, his name was Shmuel HaKatan, and we'll see why he was the one who authored it in a moment. The Rambam writes that the Rambam essentially summarized, we just summarized more or less what the Rambam writes, but at this point, obviously, we have 19 brachos because it's 18 plus 1. Now, the man who was commissioned to author this bracha, the 19th blessing, he's known as Shmuel HaKatan, Shmuel the Small. The Talmud in Sanhedrin 11a relates that why was he called the Small? Not because of his physical stature, but rather only in comparison to the prophet with the same name, Shmuel HaNavi. So while the term implies that he was the lesser of the two great men, the comparison itself is attributed to his greatness. It's kind of obvious because why would you compare somebody who lived 900 years after Shmuel, something like that, to Shmuel? It's like it's not even apples and oranges. The fact that the Gemara does so tells you something about his stature. That's one possibility in explaining why he was called Shmuel HaKatan. Second possibility is due to his great humility. Who was Shmuel HaKatan? In Pirkei Avos, which records the main teachings of many Jewish leaders from Moshe Rabbeinu through the time of the Mishnah, states that Shmuel HaKatan was known for repeating a particular verse from Mishlei. Now, if I were to tell you that if you were to look at Mishlei and try to choose a pasuk, try to choose a verse that Shmuel HaKatan used to repeat, and again, in the context of Pirkei Avos, the way Pirkei Avos works is all these different chachamim, these different sages or rabbis, he would say this, he would say that. We mentioned it tonight in Shul. Rabbi Yaakov would talk about how this world is a corridor for the world to come. They're not arguing with each other. They're all basically picking on points of Jewish philosophy or Jewish hashkafa that are so important, and they're mottos by which to live your life. And they're in agreement with each other, except that different people had different mottos by which they led their life. And that's why the Mishnah says, Hu haya omer, which is basically he lived his life in such a way that this is how he lived, and he taught by example. And this is something that he used to say all the time because it was really important to him. You know how rabbis repeat themselves when you hear the same idea from the rabbi on different occasions? Can you imagine such a thing? I think Barry knows what I'm talking about. You can imagine such a thing, right? Why? Because there are certain things the rabbis are passionate about. And different rabbis will talk about different things that they're passionate about, depending on the rabbi. So that's Pirkei Avos, essentially. They're super passionate about a particular thing. Shmuel HaKatan, what place does he have in Jewish history? He authored a bracha against heretics. He asked Hashem to destroy the enemy of the Jewish people. That happened to be they were Jewish, okay? But that's what he's known for in halacha, correct? And that's what he's known for. Now, if you were to go through Mishlei and see which pasuk did Shmuel HaKatan quote all the time, I think you'd be surprised. I think you'd be surprised by which proverb he would quote all the time. I'm going to share it with you in a moment here, just to surprise you. Here we go. And share my screen. Shmuel HaKatan Omer, B'nefol oivecha al tismach. When your enemy falls, do not rejoice. When he stumbles, let your heart not be gladdened. Perhaps God will see and will be displeasing in his eyes, and he'll turn his anger from him to you. That was the pasuk of Mishlei, and that was the motto of his life. B'nefol oivecha al tismach. When your enemy falls, do not rejoice. Almost shocking. You would think he has the exact opposite approach. So what's going on? The truth is, that's not despite his attitude towards enemies that Shmuel HaKatan was chosen to compose the blessing against the heretics, but because of it. Rabbi Irving M. Bunim, in his monumental work called Ethics from Sinai, if you've ever studied Pirkei Avos and you're looking for a very, I don't want to say a basic text, but a foundational English commentary on Pirkei Avos, it's from this Irving Bunim's commentary called Ethics from Sinai is very worthwhile. He writes, the sages found it vitally necessary to add this paragraph. The infidel heretics had simply become too much. Only a man who bore no trace of personal animosity in his heart could set forth the words. In a prayer before the portals of heaven, seeking divine protection for the people of Israel and its historic destiny, that its life and faith might be safe. There was no room for personal vindictiveness or malicious hatred. Only Shmuel the little one, humble and unassuming, formed it. The man who could not rejoice if a personal enemy fell. His words of prayer could flow from a pure love for his people, a yearning for their safety, and a desire to see their living Judaism guarded against inner destruction. Can you tell when Irving Bunim lived when she writes like that? He lived during World War II and a little bit afterwards. People wrote a little bit differently back then. Okay? He was very instrumental during World War II, together with Mike Tress in the Vad Hatzafen Yisrael in saving Jews. And during the war, they spent many Shabbosos writing affidavits because of Pikuach Nefesh and gaining sponsors and doing all kinds of things. If you haven't read the biographies of Mike Tress and Irving Bunim, I highly recommend reading them if you want to have an appreciation of American Jewish, Orthodox American Jewish history during World War II. Some of the more fascinating aspects of it are their interactions with the politicians at the time, and the interactions with people like Stephen S. Weiss and non-Orthodox Jews at the time. Very, very worthwhile biographies. If you haven't read them, they're fascinating, especially if you appreciate history. You'll enjoy them. So there are article biographies about Mike Tress and Irving Bunim. They were not rabbis, and yet they have biographies written about them, which is unusual for art school. So we've established why they organized the Shemona Esrei, the language that's used in the Shemona Esrei, the fact that the Shemona Esrei evolved a little bit over time, certainly, and then, of course, the final evolution, I shouldn't say final, but the final main way in which it evolved. What's the correct term there, Myrna? Evolution? What's the right term? Is that it? I don't know. Okay. Okay. Which is obviously the addition of the 19th bracha. Okay, so now that we have 19 brachos in the Amidah, so why do we call it the Shemona Esrei? Call it the Tshah Esrei, which means the 19th. Siddur Oter HaTefilot is one of the primary commentaries that you'll find written on the Siddur. And he writes that the reason why they didn't change the name to call it the 19 blessings is because the name was already well known by the people from the time of those who first established it till the present, and therefore didn't want to change the name. Not such a strong answer, is it? Because that's what it was called. I don't know. Can you think of a good parallel to that in our own literature? So I'm not sure if I can think of a good parallel to it.
I can tell you at our house, there's the room that has the piano and the TV and the exercise equipment and all the travel books was pink when we bought the house. We've never changed calling it to anything else but the pink room, even though it's green now.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think everyone can relate to that in their own way, for sure. Very good, Andy. Thank you. So why does Shemona Esrei call the Shemona Esrei if it's the Tshah Esrei? The answer is because it used to be called the Shemona Esrei, so we still call it the Shemona Esrei. We're very reluctant to change, we Jewish people, we Jews. Okay. Tonight was really much more a lesson in terms of the history. It was necessary to have a Shemona Esrei. Of course, it took many hundreds of years until it was finalized. Next week, in Mirz Hashem, when we meet, we're going to talk about the far reach of the Amidah, how the prayers carry our deepest yearnings and aspirations to places that are not readily conceivable. This is all based on Kabbalah and how God interacts with the universe, how our prayers travel through the various universes or worlds or spiritual realms. And by standing in the Shemona Esrei, we reach the highest level, communicate with God himself. And the words itself that the Anshe Knesset Agdola use, even though they're simple words, but they use the words that they use to compose the prayers, open up the portals of Shemayim and enable us to access Hashem in a very significant way. That's what we're going to look at next week, which answers the question of like, why the Shemona Esrei? Why not just words I want to use? Okay, which we'll talk about more next week. Okay, question. Jerry, go ahead.
Rabbi, one question, you probably touched on it. Was the Shemona Esrei seen as an individual prayer, or was it seen as part of a service? That's number one. Number two, you say the Shemona Esrei is like the backbone of the Jewish, our service today. Could you not argue, especially as it originated from the first temple, the Shema is like the heart of the service, that the Shema has almost the same importance as the Amidah in the service?
Well, to answer your second question first, the Shema has more importance in a sense, because just from a purely halachic lens, the Shema certainly is more important than Amidah. Why? Because the Shema is midoraisa. The Shema is a mitzvah in the Torah. You say the Shema once in the morning, once at night.
Mm.
Incidentally, if you daven Marv with us, or even if you didn't, then you should remember to repeat the Kriya Shema. So in a way, the Shema is more important. On the other hand, in the context of the Siddur, the Amidah is what everything leads up to. So in that sense, it's the climax. Now, with regard to your first question about the rest of the Siddur and how and when and how it was all organized, I don't know yet. I'm still researching. Hopefully we'll answer that question. Okay. Zach, did you have a question? You look like you thought you had maybe a question. Andy, go ahead.
It's actually in the chat. Just, I'm wondering why there is different wording among the different
Right.
Messiahs.
My understanding, and hopefully we'll get to it, but my understanding is, again, that it's based on Kabbalah. It's based on Kabbalah, and for example, in the Kedusha, Sfard says, Naritzcha v'nartishcha, we say Nekadesh et Shimcha. These kinds of things that have to do with Kabbalistic terminology or something like that. I don't know more than that, but I know that there's been a lot of discussion by the poskim as to whether or not it's okay to make those changes. And this was one of the major issues that the Vilna Gaon had with Hafidus, or that they changed the Siddur. It was a very, very highly contested idea.
Yeah.
Very highly contested. So now the Hasidim said that they weren't doing anything new. They had gotten it from the Arizal, but obviously not everybody agreed with that. Okay, so that's as much as I know about it. I'm sure Ami Myers can give a sheer about it, but that's as much as I know about it. Myrna?
I was just thinking about what Jerry said, and I think that although the Shema is very important, it's a progression to the Shemona Esrei, because you need to establish that Hashem Echad before you move on to do all the other blessings. So it's sort of like it centralizes your energy to move forward from whence we stood to where we're going, which is a higher plane. You're on the earth and then you move up during the Shemona Esrei. Just a thought.
Yeah. If you look at Rabbi Schwab's book on the Siddur, he does a pretty good job of describing how the order of the entire Siddur. Maybe we'll get to it. We'll see. But that's a good resource for why the order and the way that it's ordered.
Yeah, Jerry, it's a good book. Get it?
Yeah. Okay, Rabbi Schwab on prayer.
Then you have Mincha, which doesn't have a Shema in it at all. And you go right from Ashrei to Shemona Esrei. So the Shema is not an intermediate step.
It's not, but the Gemara does say that you're supposed to daven you're supposed to, I think Tosfos and Brachos, I think on Beis and Aleph discusses this. Why does Mincha have Ashrei? It's because you're not supposed to go right into Shemona Esrei. You're supposed to start off with some Torah and then
Right.
move on. Yeah. So
Right.
there's a pattern to it that Mincha is obviously much shorter, but Ashrei takes the place of everything else of all that's included in the chakras. Now you're not going to have Shema and Mincha because there's no mitzvah to say Shema and Mincha, because there's a mitzvah to say Shema in the morning and at night. But there is a pattern, which is you have a psuke de zirma of sorts. At Mincha, obviously much shorter. It's just Ashrei, and then on Shabbos, Ashrei and Uval Tzion together.
Hmm.
Okay. All right, everybody. Leila Tov.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Tonight was pretty basic. Hopefully,
you,
you learned
Barry.
some things which were new, but pretty basic ideas that probably were not brand new to most people. But nonetheless, it sets the tone and helps us understand what we're going to do moving forward. Okay.
Yes.
Leila Tov, and I thank you all for
Leila
Thank you
joining.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Sorry
you.
I was late.
You're welcome. Okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night.